This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development, providing graduate-level education to working professionals, online, on campus, and on-site. For more information, please visit study.stanford.edu.
Today we have Eric Brewer from UC Berkeley. I specifically chose this week for him to prepare for the big game. Actually just had the opportunity last week to go to a conference that was organized at Santa Clara University to really bring together people from around the world who are looking at technology use in the third world, from a variety of angles, from industry, from government, and so on. And Eric is one of the people who really stands out as having taken the work that is in an academic setting, in the computer science department at Berkeley, and made it relevant and find out how it works in the settings that are in the world that are not like Silicon Valley. I mean, in almost the opposite of Silicon Valley, where just the basics of infrastructure, the basics of getting things to work is the challenge you have to start with. And he's done a really interesting and I think great example of how do you combine the kinds of things you do in a computer science research with how do you make things relevant and useful in the world. So I'll be talking about that today.
Great. Well, it is always an honor to be at Stanford, even though I'm a Berkeley guy. I was a Berkeley undergrad too, so I'm really a Berkeley guy. But I speak at lots of places, and I always get excited to speak at Stanford. And this room in particular is always a great room as well because of just the whole feel of the room and the cameras, lights, cameras, action. So I'll be talking about, there's really two parts of this talk. The first half, which frankly I'm going to go through a little bit quickly because I've given some of these slides at Stanford before, is really just the argument that technology has a larger role to play in developing countries. And the second half of the talk will be essentially what our results are so far in trying to do research in this area. And the reason I kind of give this talk in general, although less so now, but especially over the last 3 or 4 years, is I'm on a mission to create this as a viable field in computer science. It's already a very viable field in almost every department at Stanford, including all of the liberal arts and economics and healthcare, but it's not historically a viable topic for computer science, even though computer science and electrical engineering, for that matter, have a potentially huge impact on what's possible in developing countries. So, my base claim is technology can make a difference. There have been some examples, but not a huge number. What's interesting is if you take a broad definition of technology and you look back 300 or 400 years ago, it turns out everybody was in the same rural lifestyle, right? You take a developed country 300 or 400 years ago was not significantly different from an African country or an Asian country in terms of the quality of life, the standard of living, the income, all of that. So something happened relatively recently in human history that said there'll be industrialized countries with high incomes and non-industrialized nations with low incomes. And it's pretty easy to argue there's really two things going on there. One is good governance or lack thereof, and the other is technology. Right. So if you wanted to kind of bridge this gap, those got to be the two tools you have to deploy. There's been tons of work on the good government side. That's in some sense what the IMF and the World Bank and all these aid organizations are essentially focused on in one way or another, is the governance side and trying to change the way things work. And I won't talk about that other than to say it's still important. Right. There's no one working on the technology side, I would say. To the extent that this technology in developing countries, it's somewhat accidental. Transistor radio is a good example, right? It's had some impact on developing countries, but it's the same transistor radios that were used everywhere else. They were not specialized in any way. And in fact, they typically weren't used particularly well. If you go back even to recent history in Rwanda, the genocide that's in Hotel Rwanda was fueled largely by transistor radios. Right, because the control of the media was a big factor in exacerbating the situation. So there's been impact, but not a lot. So I do think technology's got to play a role in bringing this world a little closer together. And it also, I think, it's pretty clear that the technology, as it's built for industrialized nations is not a good fit. And in fact, it's essentially becoming a worse fit over time for several reasons. One, of course, is simply cost. What we're willing to pay for technology is higher than what is capable of being paid in other countries. Another is complexity. If you were to walk up to a PC now, having never used one, it's pretty hard to get started, right? There's a certain assumption for every user that you already know how to use a PC, right? Which is not true when I started using a PC, which was an Apple II, right? It was actually still complicated, but at least everyone there assumed you didn't know how to use a PC, right? So things have changed. And of course, the other one that's big, which we don't talk about as much, is in fact power. And if we're going to really do something with technology, we also, on the side effect of that, need to deal with power. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but not much. So the mission of my group, and roughly the mission of this talk, is to argue that we need some new options, and that, gee, Silicon Valley is a smart bunch of people. There's a lot of smart people at Stanford. There's a lot of smart people at Berkeley. We ought to be able to do better than throwing technology over the fence and wishing them luck, right? And I don't usually use them, but I use it intentionally there to kind of say that's the way technology is deployed now. It's a them, and it's our technology and it's them, right? That doesn't need to be that way. In fact, one of the messages I'll talk about a lot today is if you're going to make any progress in this area, you have to be in these countries at least sometimes, right? Because you can't understand the issues from here. When I say I want to push technology, I don't really mean web access. So first thing I want to point a big disclaimer. What I mean is technology as it is an enabler for healthcare or better education or better governance, right? Those are the problems that matter. Nothing that hasn't changed, right? So maybe if web access will help some of those problems, I care about web access, but other than that, I don't care about it. In fact, the projects I'll present today, none of them are about web access. They're about the core issues of education, connectivity for education, connectivity for healthcare, right? So you have to take that kind of view on it. And also I would say we found that for us it's been more useful to focus on rural poverty rather than urban poverty. And it's not because the urban poverty isn't a big issue, it's that a lot of the problems of urban poverty are already being addressed by market forces relatively well, because urban areas, because they have a high density of users, they're an attractive market for some number of companies. And for better or worse, those companies are using technology to offer new solutions to urban markets. That is not happening in rural markets simply because of the low density of users and the logistical problems. So for a university, I actually think it makes a little more sense to focus on the rural issues because that's still 70% of the world's population, and that 70% is less likely to be addressed by natural market forces. But both kinds of poverty are very important. On top of that, I have another claim I want to just put out there, and I won't try to prove, I can't prove either one of these, they're just hypotheses. But this is one I think is interesting because it has a technical foundation that's interesting, which is to say, one thing that's interesting that makes rural areas tough is they are not amenable to infrastructure, right? What makes rural areas rural in some sense is the lack of infrastructure. And one thing that's novel in our toolkit is that wireless infrastructure is actually significantly lower cost than any other kind of infrastructure, with the possible exception of dirt roads. So my claim is, well, maybe, if we can deploy wireless infrastructure, we can use that to bootstrap the other kinds of infrastructure. And I do know that bootstrapping works. In fact, it worked for California. What caused early California infrastructure to get built? Well, it was the gold rush. So the gold was the money that caused people to come in, and they in turn needed infrastructure, and they paid for the infrastructure. So it's not a stretch to say that if you could create new rural opportunities or rural income, some infrastructure would follow, because now you're creating something where market forces could have an impact. So I would say this is not, if you don't believe this hypothesis, it does not matter for the rest of the talk, but I do think it's one of the things that makes technology different than all the previous approaches that have been tried for dealing with development, which is we actually can do infrastructure in ways that has not been possible before because the infrastructure is fundamentally lower cost. A little bit about the group we're targeting. It's commonly called the base of the pyramid. The idea that all of us are at the tippy top of the pyramid, and Silicon Valley is really the tippy top of the pyramid, right? I mean, the highest average income I think is in Atherton in the world, perhaps. If not, maybe it's Hong Kong or Dubai. But there's a small number of places, of which this area is one, where the average per capita income is extremely high. So you guys are at the tippy top of the pyramid, or at least your area is. Most people, students less so, although students at Stanford do pretty well, frankly. Even students at Stanford still, and roughly speaking, at the top of the pyramid. You may not feel like it, standing next to people, looking at all the people higher in the pyramid than you, but the vast majority of people are well below you. This is a fast-growing group, which is a bit of a problem. Although the good news is the best way to slow down the growth of the bottom of the pyramid is female literacy. So I might come back to that later, but there's a strong correlation between education of women and population growth. And it turns out that's the number one way to reduce population growth. Most are in rural villages, some are in urban slums. A small side point, it's worth trying to understand, why do people live in urban slums? In fact, it's the quality of life in an urban slum is actually worse than the quality of life in a rural village by a lot. But it persists, and in fact is growing. And you can interview people that live in urban slums, and I've done this in Dharavi, which is one of the areas of Bombay, with the translator. And you can find out a few things. One story I like is they had built some low-cost housing for people in the slums, because they're living in shanty towns, to move into. And they gave it to however they decided to allocate it. They allocated some homes. And you can come back a couple months later, and the people that they allocated the homes to are living in the shanty town. Why is that? Well, because they can sublet the apartment and make more money. So the reason you live in an urban slum is because it's a place of hope. As bad as the conditions are, you're there because it's a place of opportunity and hope, and you expect it to be temporary, right? So most of these folks are hoping that living in the shanty town is temporary, although it does vary. It's less true in Brazil. Like a favela is often a permanent place of residence for many generations. But most urban slums are a place of hope, even though the conditions are poor. They view it as a transition period. Right, so maybe it's worth doing it for a while. And the money actually flows back to typically their family in their village, the same way that the diaspora sends their money back to their home village. So there's lots of kinds of poverty here. Education levels are quite low and generally either low or non-existent, and certainly unevenly applied. And on top of that, particularly in rural areas, the markets are very disorganized. So there's a whole bunch of logistic issues that make doing anything in these areas quite a bit harder, not to mention the disease burden. Developing countries have 95% of the world's diseases. Part of that's because they're in tropical areas, and disease rates are actually higher. But part of the card is just poor drinking water, and poor hygiene, a whole bunch of related issues. So it's not a good place to be. Actually, by the way, there's the outline of the talk is at the bottom. So we've now moved to looking at what's the impact of potentially for technology. First, I want to make another high-level point, which is that there's kind of two ways you can have sustainable impact. I would say, to the extent that there's been a fallacy in the way development has been done the last, say, 50 years, which is when development's been taken seriously, because before that was colonialism, which is a different kind of development, not so effective. There's two ways to make it sustainable, but what's been done historically has essentially been philanthropy. And philanthropy is not sustainable. So we don't want to take that approach, even though philanthropy has a role to play, which is to say there have been many projects. A typical one is donation of PCs, where it's well-intentioned, it works for a while, but because there's no ongoing flow of money, those machines will eventually break and will eventually be useless. And that's happened many times, and not just with PCs, with water systems, with all kinds of technology. So if you want something to be sustainable, there's only two ways to do it. One way is to essentially say we're going to have a permanent tax that the society is going to pay to enable this thing to sustain. And people don't like taxes, but the bottom line is many things are sustainable for this reason, including the police department and the fire department. Those are things that are essentially that are sustainable by taxation. That works. In this case, the goal of technology would be? The goal would be essentially first to perhaps deliver those services at lower cost using technology. That's plausible. And maybe improve transparency, which would also lead to better governance. So you can imagine in that kind of project where you're saying it's going to be say, public education. We expect it sustainable through taxation. The way we'd apply technology was either make the education better, or make it cheaper, or make it more transparent. Those would all be reasonable technology goals.
Can you elaborate on which technology, or what your definition of technology is? Diesel engines or
Actually, I'm including all those things right now. I'll get to kind of high-tech, classic high-tech at the second half of the talk. But the first part of this talk actually applies equally well to water systems, solar power, batteries. It's very broadly technology. And you know, and I think, in fact, this part of the talk you could give mechanical engineering and would be equally true. The other way to make something sustainable is to say it's going to be a business. It's going to be a private project, and it has to at least break even. Right? It's okay if the project loses some money in the beginning, perhaps, but at some point it's got to be cash flow positive. Right? And there's a nice term for this coined by Hob Adin, who recently won the Nobel Prize. It calls it a non-loss company. And I want to bring that out because there really are three kinds of entities in the world, and they're worth knowing about this third kind. So you know what a for-profit company is. That's what Silicon Valley is really good at. Right? And you probably know what a non-profit is. Non-loss is really in the middle. So non-profit is not sustainable. It depends on ongoing outside donations for its viability. A non-loss company is something that is sustainable because it makes enough money to cover its expenses. It may not be profitable, and shareholders may not invest in it. Right? It may not have good return on investment, but it has enough return to be viable. Right? So that kind of private project is related to social entrepreneurship. It's a similar concept, but I think this is more precise in what it means to be sustainable. Right? So social entrepreneurship often confuses what's philanthropy and what's not. What I mean here is really something that's enough of a business that it is sustainable. And lots of things fit this. In particular, it's okay to have a business that makes its money because it's increasing the income of someone, and you're taking a part of that increase in income as your business model. Or you can have a business model where you're simply saving costs. And I'll get to costs in a minute, but those are two ways you could apply technology, again, broadly speaking. Things that fit this model are vocational education. So I would say, the top public education's a public good, right? But private education, vocational training, which is highly prized, by the way, particularly English language education, that's a business. That's a very viable business. It's a business in many countries. Entertainment is a viable business. Right? Even poor people spend a lot of money on entertainment. Right? So if you could somehow use technology for entertainment, for better or worse, you could talk about whether that's a good thing or not. That would certainly be a viable business. It is a viable business already. It's okay, in my mind, in this model, if you have to lose some money at the beginning. That's the classic venture capital model, right, is you lose some money in order to get to the place where you're non-loss or for profit. So it's okay to have some philanthropy if it's to kickstart something, but at some point you have to stop taking new funding and be self-sustaining. And I'll talk about this more, but the way we're going to make this kind of scale is typically by franchising. And franchising, to most people in the US, means Starbucks or McDonald's. What we'll see in developing countries is a kind of franchising where franchisees are used to spread the technology, but they're not actually used to provide capital. Like normal Starbucks, someone has to put in the capital to actually open the Starbucks. That's what the franchisee does. In developing countries, we're going to see franchises, which I'll get to in a minute, where really what's going on is the money's coming from typically a third-party loan or something, when what you really want is the entrepreneur to actually make it a viable local business. And you're using the franchising to scale the system up, because we have a lot of people we have to get to, right? You need a lot of franchisees to cover even India. So again, that's I'll give a few more examples, and then we'll move to the technical part of the talk. So here's an example of a real public good project, which was using technology to essentially help eradicate the black fly that carries river blindness. And this is in Ghana and Western Africa. So what they did, this is pretty clever, is they said, well, we know this fly has the larvae live in certain conditions that have to do with rainfall and standing water, and we can actually, using weather information, predict where those places are going to be. So we'll use some sensors to measure conditions locally. We'll use satellites to build a giant sensor network over West Africa that tells us what are all the places that are prime for propagation of the black fly. And then we'll go spray larvicide in those areas. Right? So what's the technical part here is for a given amount of spray, you can now spray a much larger area because now you know when and where to spray. Right? Because you have sensors telling you what the right conditions are. So first thing I want to point out is this is basically just a sensor network. It's a big sensor network. It uses relatively expensive sensors, but the bottom line is if you would put on your computer science hat, this is a sensor network, and it's using us, telling us when to spray. Right? This is a viable PhD project for someone at Stanford in computer science. Right? So if you just said, okay, suppose you took this on as your PhD topic. Is this a viable topic? Absolutely. It's a sensor network. There's some technical issues. There's a bunch of other tricky things. The bottom line, it's a viable project. Suppose you did that as your project. What was the result? Well, protects 30 million people from infection, right? Because now you're spraying areas. These are real numbers. Real 30 million people are in these areas that have been sprayed and are now not getting infected, right? Another result, 100,000 square miles of land that was unusable is now usable. It was usable in the sense that you could grow crops there, but you wouldn't grow crops there because if you grew crops there, you'd get bitten by this fly and you'd go blind. Right? So no one was actually farming there. Right? So wouldn't you like to put this in your abstract of your PhD? That'd be pretty good. And now to be fair, you wouldn't actually probably get this in your abstract because you do the pilot in your PhD and you'd have to postdoc or something to actually do the deployment. But even just the pilot for this would be a phenomenal PhD. Phenomenal. It was not done by a computer scientist, by the way. It was done by a development person that had to learn enough about computers to make the project work. Right? But yeah, too bad for us. Right? Many other public good examples. I'm going to speed through this because I want to get to a lot of other stuff, but disaster relief is a big one. Primary education is still a big one. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Water quality has lots of needs for technology. I want to go into the private examples, and I'll just make one quick point, which is to say it turns out it's actually very expensive being poor. That if you're poor, you pay more for everything, a lot more. 2 to 10 times the cost for water. Well, why does water cost so much? Well, because it comes in a bottle. Assuming you buy clean water. Typically, it's so expensive you don't. You just drink dirty water. But if you want clean water, it's much more expensive if it comes in a bottle than if it comes in a pipe. What about medicine? Why is medicine more expensive? Well, it's more expensive because you buy one pill at a time because you have a cash flow problem, right? Versus going the kind of Costco route and buying the giant bottle of aspirin, which has a low cost per unit but takes more cash flow. Right? Why is credit expensive? Well, because you don't have any collateral. Actually, typically you do. It's called dead capital. There's a whole book on this, which simply says many families own the land they've been living on for generations, but they have no way to document it to the point where they could get a loan. Right? So that's called dead. It's capital, but it's dead capital because they can't use it for purposes of collateral. So without collateral, your credit costs are high. And it's not atypical to see 1,000% credit charges, 1,000% annual percentage rate. More typical is 50%. Right? So if you wanted to get a loan without credit in India, 50% is probably what you'd pay in terms of annual percentage rate. So one thing to think about this is poor people are already spending money, right? Because they overpay for everything they get, there's plenty of room in the system to, if you could deploy technology that would reduce those costs, that would pay for the technology. So it is a very broad point that there's room to pay for technology just by the existing money flow of poor people. By the way, there's a lot of them, so that helps. The other thing that I think is a bit of a myth is to realize that poor people have disposable income. Every poor person I've met, with a few exceptions, even though they might be hungry and they don't have a house, they don't have running water, they still have disposable income. Right? And part of that is just human pride, that for everyone you talk to, they always know someone who's worse off than they are. Right? And there's a certain kind of natural human pride in that. Right? Well, I may be at the bottom of the pyramid, but I'm above that person. So if you look at what does disposable income go to, it's not houses, obviously, but it might be a TV or a radio or a pressure cooker, or it turns out even Communications, 7%. 7% of rural income in Bangladesh is spent on telecommunications. Why do you think that is? Who are they calling? You can probably guess this, actually. Family that's far away. Family that's far away because they're off somewhere like an urban slum or another country raising money for the family. So the main purpose of this 7%, the reason it's a good investment is for that 7%, you get people to send you money. Right? So that money in some sense is not really rural income. It's foreign income of relatives sent to rural areas to be spent on the telecommunications that enable that transaction. So in fact, this money could all be spent on email instead, and it would be cheaper. Because what it's being used for is managing cash transactions, essentially. By the way, moving money from out of country into country also is expensive. Every country has this kind of gray market system for how this gets done, typically to avoid taxes. But the bottom line is, it's not atypical to spend more than 10% of the money being transferred gets lost in the process. There's another place technology could help in a very trivial way. So last private example, and this is a slide I've been using for several years, but it looks like I'm just jumping on the Hob Adin's bandwagon. I'm happy to say I've been on the bandwagon a long time. It's a great bandwagon. You're welcome to join me. So he just won the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, because of this work. And I'll go, you may have known something about him because of the press coverage he got, but I bet you don't really understand the story because it's something that wasn't covered very well in the press in terms of why this is so important. So first, a little observation. How he got into this is he's a Bangladeshi economist, and he realized in the 70s that if he gave money to his rich friends, they'd forget to pay him back. If they gave money to his poor friends, they'd always pay him back. Because it was such an honor to be trusted by this other person. So they took it very seriously, this loan. Whereas it's not that his other friends were not trustworthy, it's just it was a relatively small amount among them. And it's the same way that if I gave, say, Scott $20, if he didn't pay me back, I really wouldn't care. I wouldn't even notice, right? And so it's not about the $20, it's just about, he'll give me something else some other day, right? That would be a reasonable friendship expectation. But his poor friends, for whom it was some work to pay him back, would always pay him back. And that struck him. So he has a huge number so he started just making loans, and then he opened a bank that made loans. And of course, he tried to open a bank in the normal way, and everyone said, well, you can't do a bank that loans to the poor, because they won't pay you back. So he ended up opening his own bank, because he couldn't convince any other bank to do this. And I think that perseverance is why he really deserves the Nobel Prize. So he's done this for a while, but now we're at the point where he's loaned $4 billion in increments of, say, $50 to $100 to $200. So the total number of transactions is astonishing, right? Huge number of small transactions, and a huge recovery rate. Almost 99% of the money they loan out comes back. Now, it's actually better than a U.S. bank recovery rate, although that's a little misleading because U.S. banks have a target recovery rate that's lower than that, and they have it lower so that they can do some part of their portfolio that's more risky to try and get a higher average return. But nonetheless, it's a true statement. This is a better recovery rate than banks in developed countries, right? So poor people do pay their money back, and there's some tricks to it, which I don't have time to go into, but a lot of it comes down to a kind of a small village effect, where if you loan to someone in a village, or you're loaning to a group in the village, which is more typical, members of the group will make sure the loan gets paid back, including potentially paying it back themselves to maintain the external positive image of the group as a whole. So the peer pressure and small village politics plays a role in why this recovery rate is so high, but it doesn't matter. It is high.
And do you know if there was any technology involved in managing billions or millions of transactions?
No, there was 12,000 staff people, many of whom, by the way, were former loanees. The other thing that's a little misleading about that general number is it's not like that money. One way to think about this that makes it, I think, more believable is that most loans go to people that have already paid back previous loans, right? So although there's no collateral, there is a track record of paying back loans. So the first loan, yeah, you take some risk on, But most of the loans are actually not the first loan. They're the second, third, fourth loan. So a typical sequence would be you take a loan, you buy a goat. You can't eat the goat, right? What you do is you sell the milk from the goat to pay back the loan, right? So what do you do after you pay back the loan? You buy another goat, right? And then you buy 2 goats and 4 goats. And pretty soon you have a herd of goats and a piece of land, and maybe some employees. So the path out of poverty, which is what I want to talk about next, 46% have crossed the poverty line, is by taking a sequence of loans and paying them back as you build up your little mini empire, your little goat empire. Most loans are historically are for dairy animals like goats. But they could be anything that has a potential recurring revenue stream. So, this is remarkable. There's nothing else I know of in the world that has this kind of effect on getting people out of poverty, right? A huge, huge impact. So this number, in my mind, is why he deserves the Nobel Prize. Right? Because no one else has come close to that number on any other project, except other people doing this. General area is called microfinance. So it's something every student at Stanford should know about microfinance. I would say it's just a policy thing. Okay, so that's the bank. Why am I bringing that up? Because microfinance is going to be one of the ways we're going to get technology to have an impact in developing countries. It is the financial mechanism that's going to pay for the deployment of technology. And we have an example of this also in Bangladesh, where some entrepreneurs said, well, instead of buying a goat, let's buy a phone. And what's our recurring revenue? It's selling minutes to my neighbors, right? So the loanee, which is almost always a woman, it's for cultural reasons in Bangladesh, although it applies actually to most of the world, I would argue. Actually, if you want to understand that, the short version of it is, it's good to loan to moms. It's not so much that they're women, it's that they're moms, and they have a higher calling, which is their children, that causes them to be good risks, because they will pay back their loan, because they're on a larger mission. I have no proof for that statement, but having seen this many times, I think that's basically what's going on. So you loan to a woman, and most women in Bangladesh of the right age are moms, and so it's hard to distinguish the two. And she becomes the payphone for her village. Now this, by the way, wouldn't work in India because India already had a good payphone system. Bangladesh did not. So in fact, there was a need for telecommunications services that was latent. So, how does it work? You pay per minute. It's like a super payphone. I call it a super payphone because if the phone's for you, she'll bring you the phone, right? Even if it's in the middle of the night. So there was a great interview where they interviewed the mother-in-law of one of these phone ladies. And this is, of course, a loaded question. The interviewer asked the mother-in-law, how do you feel when that blasted phone rings in the middle of the night? Right? And again, playing in part on the classic mother-in-law, daughter-in-law conflict, which is somewhat acute in Bangladesh, but actually in India as well. The mother-in-law's answer is, I love it. Every time that phone rings, we make money. Right? True story. Right? They do make money. So they've made loans for phones, I think actually now over 100,000 times. And it turns out this covers 50,000 of the 68,000 villages in Bangladesh. And why that's such an amazing number is it basically means that if you have a technology that has at least a non-loss plan, you can, just using microfinance, finance it to the point where it will scale to the entire country. All right. So the reason I cover microfinance is to convince people that there's a way to deploy stuff at large scale. Right? This 60 million users makes this one of the larger cell phone companies in the world. Not the largest. China Mobile is larger, but it's up in the top 10. So this is how we're going to make whatever we can come up with scale. The second problem this solves is, I think, pretty interesting as well, which is it really solves the maintenance problem. So on average, the phone lady makes about twice as much income as the average person in her village. So there's good incentive to be the phone lady. In fact, it's essentially a kind of local monopoly, kind of like the cable system in the US. So once you pick a phone lady, you can't have the next door neighbor be a phone lady too, or neither one is going to make any money, right? So they do a little bit of kind of tiny local monopolies to make sure that each business is a viable business. And frankly, this is what franchisees in general are supposed to do. There's not supposed to be 4 Starbucks on the 4 corners of the street, which actually apparently does exist somewhere, right? That's not good for any of the 4. So there's a little bit of planning at the higher level where you put these. But the thing I want to get through that's a little bit subtle is it turns out this system has been very robust, meaning that many people have got phones working most of the time. And that's surprising because most technology projects in developing countries do not work, or do not work for a long time. So why does this one work? And the answer is because somebody's income depends on it. All right? The rural women of Bangladesh, particularly the ones that self-select to be phone ladies, are not stupid. So if they need to learn something, including, by the way, literacy, in order to keep their income, they'll do so. So many illiterate phone ladies can do a fine job of guiding you on how to make international phone calls, including knowing all the country codes by heart. Another phone lady actually put up a 30-foot pole with an antenna on it so that she could get better reception during the day. Now, how she learned to put up a GSM antenna, I have no idea, right? But the point is, she did so because she was highly motivated, right? And she's smart. No education, but smart, right? So there's a lot of latent talent in these countries, and if you give them an opportunity, they'll rise to the occasion. And I've seen that many, many times. All right, so I'll skip this slide, but there's many other things: vocational education, supply chains, healthcare, which I'll cover later in the talk. Huge number of other things that are totally reasonable, viable businesses that can scale. So all that is basically to lead up, and I'm actually pretty much fine on time, to say what is it we actually do. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's a reason to care about technology for developing countries and that it could have a large impact. What we've been doing, and we're in our, I guess, 3.5 year of our 5-year NSF grant, and we have some support from a few other companies, and we include, it's a pretty broad group. We cover, at the moment we're covering everything from CS and power systems to social science, screen development. We're even starting to look at chemistry for novel kinds of batteries, because it turns out there's no limit to the kinds of technologies that are needed in these areas. So it tends to naturally broaden, which is frankly difficult from a management perspective, but certainly educational. The basic strategy of the group is quite simple. It's really go to a developing country, design with them a technical solution to a problem they have, and then deploy it. And you really have to do this co-design, co-deploy is our mantra, and it's important on many fronts. And one thing that's interesting is you actually have to make some progress in the first 6 months. And why is that? It's because every decent NGO that you might work with has been burned in the past by promises about development that didn't come true, right? So when you go to them and say, we're a technical group and we want to help you, they're like, oh, that's nice, good luck with that. When you have something, come back, right? They're very skeptical, and rightfully so. So actually our strategy has been essentially to then do some very small project that we can do in a 6-month time frame to show that A, we're serious, and B, that we're competent. Right? And after that, we start to have a more serious relationship with that group. And that's, I would say, just good advice if you're going to do any work in this area, is pick short deadlines that you can meet. I would say one general problem with development space is that people pick projects that have 5-year plans. And that's okay if you're building a railroad, right? It's not okay in technology. The amount of things that change in 5 years is so high that the chance that your plan is still a good plan after 5 years is 0. Right? So particularly in technical projects, you need to have 12-month plans and short little steps, because the situation changes much. Not only does the technical situation change, but one of our projects ended essentially because the key minister was involved in a sex scandal and got kicked out. Right? And now we have to work on a new relationship with the replacement government to keep our project going. Right? Well, if that was part of a 5-year plan, that would be a big bummer. It was part of a 6-month plan. We could work around it. We just don't do that project anymore. We have other things we can adjust to. So some agility is useful. We're in a lot of countries, mostly India, Ghana, and Rwanda. This is some of the research agenda. I'm going to cover a few of these today, but rural connectivity is a big one. I'll talk about telemedicine. I'll talk about education. I won't talk about power, although there's one of the things we've developed that I think is quite cool is a $50 board that you connect between solar panels and car batteries to make a very efficient solar system. You can connect the panels directly to the batteries, but it has two problems. You don't get that much electricity out of the panels, and it shortens the life of the batteries substantially. Right, so even though you have to pay for this third component, it gives you 15% more energy, and we believe it'll about double the life of your batteries. And that $50 number is the unit, is the cost for one made by hand. So if we make them in volume, it'd be quite a bit lower. So we're working on power issues as well, although I won't talk about it any more than that. The main thing we've done that we've made the most progress on is actually rural connectivity. And the approach we're taking is essentially to make Wi-Fi work over long distances. And the reason to do this is that Wi-Fi is super inexpensive because of its very high volume. Right, so if we can get Wi-Fi to work, and I mean long distances like 50 kilometers, if we can get it to work, it's going to be the cheapest solution, right? Because nothing else has the kind of volume that this has other than cell phones. It also turns out to be quite low power. That $50 board I talked about has plenty of power to do a remote wireless relay that could be in the middle of nowhere. I'll skip over the rest of that. I have my most technical slide. If you're not a technology person, you can go to sleep for one slide, and we'll go back to the less technical. What we actually did to make Wi-Fi work is about 4 things. But the big one is you have to realize that Wi-Fi is made for short distances, and you listen to figure out if the channel is clear. Well, that's just like listening in a conversation. If you have two people that are very far apart, listening locally doesn't tell you if the other person is busy or not. Someone else could be talking to them that you don't know about. Right? So in fact, you can't really use the basic media access control mechanism of Wi-Fi at these longer distances. So instead, we move to something that's based on time division, and we agree on what time it is, and we agree on when you get to send. So that's the first thing to change. That turns out to also be a better choice for voice as well, because you get more predictable packet arrivals, so you get less jitter and better voice quality. Next problem is that when you're at very long distances, the way Wi-Fi works is it has one packet outstanding at a time. So it sends a packet, waits for an acknowledgement. If you're going 300 feet, the waiting time is so small it's irrelevant. If you're going 50 kilometers, it's actually many microseconds to the point where most of the time your link is idle because you're in this waiting state. So if you want to get high bandwidth at long distances, which I think is actually what's novel about our solution, you have to have a bunch of packets in flight at one time. So you need bulk pipelining packets and bulk acknowledgements. We did that. There's other TCP problems you have to fix, which generally have to do with TCP doesn't work well when you have non-congestion losses. And you do, over at least long distance wire links, have wireless losses, so you got to deal with that. There's some related work on that. We took a slightly different approach. And then another one that's a little tricky is you want to put 2 antennas on the same pole to do a multi-hop network, and you got to make sure those 2 antennas don't interfere with each other. So the easy way to do that is put them on a separate channel. That would work, but we only have basically 3 channels in regular Wi-Fi. So we don't actually want to have to give each direction its own channel. It turns out you can put them on the same channel if you make sure that they're either both transmitting or both receiving. Because even though they're both yelling at the same time, they're yelling in opposite directions with directional antennas, and the other sides can hear. So you get 100% of the bandwidth having them talk at the same time as long as they talk in different directions. All right, so that's a nice trick. All right, end of technical talk. What does that mean? What it means is if you go over long distances, we get much better bandwidth than Wi-Fi, regular Wi-Fi. So I'm happy to say some of this at least is data from actual links, some of it's from simulation, but we do get about 4 to 6 megabits per second, even over 70 kilometers, right? Very long distances. We're going to try to set the world record at 300 kilometers in January and try to also get more than 5 megabits per second. When people do world records for Wi-Fi, they don't do any of the bandwidth changes, so they can get a signal to propagate that far. So they can get 1 packet there and back. If you do the math, that comes out to be about 7 kilobytes or 7 kilobits per second. Right? It's not a useful link for something like voice. We want to go 300 kilometers and get 4 to 6 megabits per second. And we'll see if we can do that. So summary of results, we have links in several different countries, including Berkeley, the country of Berkeley. Some people think it's a different country. Some people would like it to be a different country. Our longest link right now is 58 kilometers in Ghana. Our best bandwidth is about 18 megabits per second. More typical for us is 4 to 6 megabits per second, which is what you get with 11B at these distances. It's about 7 watts for a radio, which is quite low. It means it's very easy to power that with one solar panel and one battery.
For the transmitters?
That's for the Linux board and 2 radios. The radios only take 100 milliwatts of transmit power, maybe 300 milliwatts. Multiply by 10 because to get a good signal, you need a steep amplifier. So maybe 3 watts of the 7 is for the transmitter, and the rest is for the actual CPU and memory.
Going across 12 different country boundaries, what sort of regulations do you run into?
The question is, what kind of regulation issues do we have? It's still the case that most countries in Africa, the 2.4 spectrum is not unlicensed. It's still licensed. So you have to have a partner that has a license. Typically, a lot of the stuff is simply not regulated. It's not legal or illegal. We call it unlegal. So there's a bunch of places where simply there is no written law other than perhaps to say that it's under the authority of a particular agency. And then they may have their own rules, but they're not actually codified in the law of the country. But in practice, what happens is either you're in a country that has unlicensed spectrum, in which case it's really, in practice, unregulated, broadly speaking, or it's licensed and you have to go find someone that has a license or buy one. But typically, it's too hard to buy one, too slow, so you have to find a partner that has a license. And in fact, when we started, India was licensed. And I actually gave a talk in Delhi to the Regulatory Authority of India, in which I was one of several people arguing you need to unlicense 2.4 and ideally 5.8 as well. And I can't say I caused them to unlicense it, but I've certainly one of many voices at a convenient time that helped to get it changed. And it has been helpful for us. But before that, we actually had a license in India to do 2.4.
So these numbers are legal in the US?
These, I'm sorry?
The numbers you have here, like you said about amplifiers, which may or may not be.
These are without amplifiers. These are unmodified Wi-Fi cards. And that's really important because it means that they're the same high volume cards that you can actually buy. So no, these are higher power off-the-shelf cards than usual, but they're absolutely stock off-the-shelf cards. There is no power amplifier in any of these numbers.
So your antennas are the directional complement.
The gain comes from directional antennas, which is great because they take no electricity at all, right? They're completely passive. And they also tend to be not.
About 24 dBi now.
Oh, actually, we can get 30. We have one. Actually,
No,
you go to
legal,
6-foot
you
dish.
have a legal limit of 24 dBi.
In the U.S. That
In the
limit does
US.
not apply elsewhere.
Yes.
And even then, I would say, well, I won't go there, but there are definitely people using more than 24 in the U.S. without consequence. And if you're really not interfering with someone like you would do in, like some of these places are Indian reservations, there is no one to interfere with. It's a community service to actually use the larger antennas. So I want to move to telemedicine. So that's a picture up there of a typical tier link. That's the 24 dBi antenna. That little white box on the pole is a embedded Linux router box with the Wi-Fi card inside. It's actually somewhat useful to have the Linux computer actually outdoors on the pole because it makes it close to the antenna physically. And so we don't have the signal loss of going over the long wire. There's one wire that comes down. You can see it right here, actually. That's an Ethernet cable that also carries 12-volt power or 48-volt power, depending on the board. So really, that's it. It's a pole, guy wires, the box, and the power over Ethernet cable. And that whole pole, box, and everything is about $400 in unit one quantity. If we were to mass produce these, the numbers would be quite a bit lower. Although some of that's not going to change. Like the box itself is $20, the antenna is $80. So there's some, we'll see how much that part would compress. This is a one-room rural vision clinic. It belongs to Aravind Eye Hospital, who's one of our NGO partners in Tamil Nadu. It's a pretty amazing hospital. They had 2 million patients in 2004. They did 200,000 cataract surgeries. Right? So this is a major operation. It's a for-profit hospital, or maybe a non-loss hospital. And they found by looking at their patients that the limitation of their hospital was, in fact, how far people were willing to walk to get treatment. So they would treat everybody in about a 20-kilometer radius of the hospital. But if you draw a 20-kilometer radius around all 5 of their hospitals, that still leaves a huge fraction of even their state, Tamil Nadu, not covered. So how do you reach the rest of those people? And what they used to do is they'd have a van that had a satellite dish on top, and they would drive around to different rural villages and provide eye treatment for the weekend. And it turns out that was relatively expensive to do, but had another big minus, which is it was no good at prevention. A lot of the eye problems in India are preventable. The two big ones actually are cataracts, which are due largely, or at least some people believe largely, to indoor smoke. And if you wash your eyes out after cooking with wood indoors, you will prevent cataracts. So that's an educational thing that could make a difference. The other one is eye degeneration related to diabetes. And of course, many people don't know they have diabetes, or if they know they have diabetes, they don't know that it affects their vision. It can affect their vision. So one reason to go to a vision center is because it has a permanent presence in the community that's much better on the prevention front than a van that shows up periodically. On top of that, it turns out it's also cheaper for reaching a certain number of people. So there's a big need for eye care, although I would point out the link we're using has nothing to do with eye care per se. It's for any other kind of medicine. It just happens to be this is an eye hospital, so today I'll be talking about eye care. And their goal is to actually have 50 of these centers. So the questions I'd expect you to ask are, how do they use the link? Does it work? Are patients using it? Is it sustainable? Those are the kinds of questions you should hopefully be thinking about. This is a Google Earth map of the current 5 centers that we have. And the links are actually not all that long, because again, their general goal was to go about 20 kilometers away in every direction and establish some presence there that would expand the reach of the hospital. So all of the hospitals eventually will have this kind of ring around them. Each green line is a link, and you'll see some lines are directly connected to the hospital, and some of them go through a relay. And this is actually where we are in India. So we're on the western edge of Tamil Nadu, which is one of the major states of southern India. This is another vision center just with some indoor pictures. It's always one-room clinic, always has one staff person, I believe always a woman. You can think of her as a kind of a nurse, but she's not really a nurse in the sense of the US term. She's had about 6 months training in eye care. So she knows a lot about eye issues, but does not know anatomy, is not a general purpose nurse, right? And usually local girl trained by the hospital, which is good because she speaks the local dialect and she often knows people. And so usually she's a kind of up-and-coming young woman in her community. There are 2 pieces of equipment, the slit eye lens that she's using there, and a PC with a microphone and a webcam, which is what we use for the video conference. We originally started this, we had this big idea that we were actually going to send, eye photos and high-quality JPEGs and collect vitals and send that over the link. Turns out none of that matters. The only thing that matters is the actual bond between the patient and the doctor that they get over a high-quality video connection. So having the doctor tell you that you need to go to the hospital is very different than having the nurse tell you. Doctors are very respected in India. And so the value of the system largely is simply the video conference, and the rest of it is, in some sense, never got deployed and doesn't matter. If you want to know the vitals, the nurse takes the vitals and you ask the nurse over the video conference. There's no reason to send them in some fancy data format, right? So again, we tend to be technology-centric. We forget these things. There might be better ways, right? There is no better way to do the video conference, though. So we have some data from the 5 centers. We've been running them since January. About 2,000 patients per month right now are being examined. So I think this is a pretty phenomenal result. These are real people that have vision problems. Turns out about 10% of them have real vision problems, either meaning glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, or cataracts. All right, so these are 10% of that too. So 200 people a month are getting diagnosed, and most of them, about 85%, are getting treatment for significant eye stuff, right, that they would not have otherwise been treated for. In fact, we interviewed one guy, and he's had cataracts, and he obviously has cataracts that are far along, because you can look at his eye, and you see a cloudy eye, it means it's cataract. If it's cloudy, it means it's a severe cataract. So you ask him, well, someone must have told you had cataracts. Why didn't you go to the hospital? Well, it was too far, and I don't know if they would treat me if I went there. That's a big issue in a lot of developing countries because it's not atypical to go to, say, a government office and have to come back the next day or some other time, right? So there's no expectation that if he went to the hospital that he would get treated. There was also no expectation that it would be free. And both were true. It was true if he went, he would have been treated and it would have been free, but he didn't know that. So he didn't go. He didn't go for 7 years, right? So 7 years he lived with bad cataracts that are now gone, right? And all that changed really was he saw a doctor in this center that told him he ought to go get cataract surgery, and the nurse gave him a little referral card, which, by the way, is totally superfluous. It's not necessary. But you give the patient a referral card so that they feel like they're actually entitled to a visit. They're entitled to have the card or not, but they don't believe you without the card. The card is for their peace of mind. And a little slightly for scheduling, but really it's irrelevant. If he showed up without a card and the visibly bad cataracts that he has, and visibly poor, you can tell poor people in India because they look a lot older than they are, is one way to tell. Much older than they are. It's like you would be astounded guessing ages. You'd be very wrong about how old you think people are, poor people. So the hospital staff knows which people are poor just on site. They also try to figure out income officially, but the bottom line is they know and they're pretty accurate. So he would have been treated just fine had he known to go. Another problem with blind people, by the way, is that they don't go is they typically have to take somebody with them to go to the hospital, right, to help them navigate the buses or whatever. And so that's actually 2 lost incomes, not 1. It's the opportunity cost of going is high. So that's another reason people didn't go. The center actually makes money. I'm missing a bullet. Maybe it's coming. There it is. It makes about $464 in revenue per month per center. It doesn't sound like a lot. This is the breakdown. It's mostly from selling eyeglasses. And secondarily from selling medicine, typically something like antibiotics, so like drops for your eyes. They have other fees, the actual visit fees. The nice thing about the visit fees are you actually pay, I believe, it depends a little bit, but either for 3 visits or 7 visits. You can't actually pay for 1 visit. And it took me a while to figure that out. It costs 25 cents, by the way, for a visit. Why do you pay, you get 7 for 25 cents? It's because they want you to go to your follow-up appointments. If you had to pay for the follow-up appointments, you wouldn't go, right? So you actually get the whole package up front, essentially. So make not a lot of money, maybe $16 a day on average per center. It turns out that's enough. So there's some amount of money it costs to build up the center. You have to actually set up the room, you have to buy the PC, the chair, things like that. You actually have to put up the link, which I put down as $1,000, even though I told you it's less than that. But that's a conservative number. You do the math, you say, and it turns out the actual operating cost, which is mostly the staff, the nurse salary, but also the electricity and maybe some rent, is about $150 a month. And so if you just do the math, you make about $460 in revenue, of which I think it's some significant fraction of that's profit. I don't have the profit numbers. Actually, they're somewhat hard to get out of the hospital. But bottom line is you just say, assuming it costs you $10,000 up front to build it, and you make a certain amount, a few $100s a month in profit per month, you can pay that off in 2.5 years. So it is a non-loss business. So based on this, they're going to go to 50 vision centers. I've actually allocated the roughly $10,000 for 24 of them. So they're going to build 24 more for sure. But if they go to 50, this implies roughly it's about 10,000 patients per center per year. So about 500,000 patients. And assuming the 10% number sticks, we should see about 50,000 people per year with significant vision improvement, such as going from non-functioning vision to functioning vision. And by the way, 85% of the people that get vision improvement can return to income generation, right? Meaning they can, whatever they did before to make money, maybe they won't make as much going back, but they will return to income generation about 85% of the time based on the past cataract surgeries, right? So this is our highlight result, to say, right? And I just want to emphasize this a little more. These are absolutely real patients, real people. You can go meet them. This guy here is the guy that didn't get treatment for 7 years, right, until this vision center was put in place. Right. I don't remember his name, which I should know actually.
Did the idea for the vision centers pre-exist the idea of using the computer links with them, or was it
They
part
had,
of
in fact, they had
vision
tried
centers?
vision centers using a variation of actually cordless phone technology. And the bandwidth of that was about 33 kilobits. And the bottom line was the video quality you can get at 33 kilobits is not sufficient for this
The
application.
video was critical for the centers. They couldn't have detached centers.
What's really going on here is you're multiplexing the doctors. The doctors are the most scarce resource, and it's in fact too expensive in doctor time to have them go in a van or to have them leave the hospital at all. So basically what they typically do is they do surgery in the morning and they do calls, different kinds of visits in the afternoon, including the telemedicine visits. But what's really going on is you're bringing rural patients to urban doctors. Right, and that's really what's making this work. Right. The traditional answer in development, but people, by the way, is to have a doctor in every village, and that's just completely unrealistic. In fact, you can't keep the doctors and nurses they have in the country because you can make. If you're a better example is Thailand, because I know this one exactly. You can make about double the income if you're a doctor in Thailand if you become a nurse in the U.S. Right. So even though it's kind of a step down in the kind of hierarchy of medicine, it's so much more money to be a U.S. nurse than to be a developing country doctor that it's very difficult to get doctors to stay in country. And even Yerevan loses a lot of its doctors to private practice. They train all these doctors to do these cataract surgeries, and they can make more money in private practice than they can in this kind of semi-public hospital. But they actually decided that's okay, that part of the Yerevan mission now is to train doctors. So they just expect a high turnover rate, and as long as they have a good flow coming in, that's fine with them.
I have a question about that. So is the social aspect of this that people trust that this information is coming from somebody they respect? So the doctor title is really the key, and so therefore the follow-up, the adherence to instructions.
That is
sort of
definitely a
paying
big part of it.
attention.
Seeing the doctor on TV, which is a literal quote, is a big part of the experience.
But I mean, the experience, can you drill into that a little bit? I mean, what is because if that's what it is, I'm just curious. I mean, this is a model for how to deliver medicine, period. It's not
It
just
is.
about vision.
It's not just about vision.
So if that's really the crust of the biscuit, I mean, if doctors are this scarce resource, do you know, have you looked at what that is so that you can try it? I mean, because that's...
Oh, I think we're gonna try this with other hospitals in other fields, and I expect it to work quite well.
What about this doctor business? I mean, what is it about that connection? Do you know? The social, emotional aspect of that, is it...
There's two things going on. One is just the place the doctor holds in society has respect. The other part of it is simply the fact that the doctor speaks with certain authority. And in fact, part of the conversation, maybe I'll show a video. It's not a good video to warn you, and it won't work over the transmitter at all. In fact, part of the conversation is often in English or another language between the doctor and the nurse. And even though the patient may not understand that, that's actually a good thing. It makes it feel like there's something serious going on here. Right? So part of it is the faith in the doctor, but also it's the computers, the whole setup that implies, and also the reputation of the hospital itself is quite good. All these things are factors. Let's start here, and I'll come back to you, Terry.
So if this is all just a big placebo effect to make the people feel good to get them to the hospital, couldn't they just have a video of a doctor and show like even more people every day?
A, that wouldn't work, but B, it's 90% of the people that go do not have significant vision problems. Right? They might have small vision problems, and that's actually most people that get treated do not need to go to the hospital. So in fact, the Rural Vision Center provides 100% of the care for 90% of the people. Right? And that's and the educational aspect is not to be underestimated either. Those are, in some ways, prevention is the biggest single thing they could do in terms of overall impact down the road.
But I think there's two components here which I think we get confused between. One is, how much is the actual knowledge and expertise of the doctor being tapped into during that video?
Significant.
And
I mean, these
otherwise you could replace all the doctors with actors.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a patient interview, and it's absolutely, every interview I've seen maybe, I've only probably seen 10, say. They're all different.
So that's not a placebo.
Right.
That's
That is
really
not a
getting-
placebo. The doctor's actually giving care.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's prevention. You said a lot of it's prevention, so it's about the person respecting the information.
No. The part of this prevention is just the center being there with its posters that people see and people being aware that eye issues are something they need to think about. So prevention has nothing to do with the video conference at all.
Doctors not having anything to do with prevention.
Not per se, no. The nurse has a lot to do with prevention.
She
She's
has
a
that
community
education.
girl, and she sees people, and she's spreading the word. She's evangelizing as part of her job. But even just being there in a central location in the village with posters that talk about eye hygiene and cooking indoors, all those things help prevention. But mostly it's just presence. The doctor does not, frankly, do that much on the prevention front.
I'm just trying to tease out, because if 90% of it's prevention and he's not involved in it, but the doctors.
No, you're misunderstanding. 90% of the patients don't need to go to the hospital. They might need antibiotics, which the nurse is the pharmacist too, so she can give out antibiotics on the doctor's advice. So a more typical case would be patient comes in with red eyes, doctor investigates, decides to go with antibiotics, the nurse dispenses the antibiotics, schedules a follow-up visit. That's a more typical visit.
I can talk to you later. I don't want
Okay, we'll take
No,
one more.
I'm a professor of medicine in India,
Okay.
and I'm a doctor, and I would still want to see a doctor, whether it's face to face or on the
Yeah,
video or whatever.
I work in this area, so I'm trying to tease out what is going on really. But that's where that's the bottleneck. The doctor's the bottleneck.
The doctor is the bottleneck.
It's not going to change. So how do we, but the number of people in population will continue to get bigger. So we have a problem.
The doctor is able to reach out to more people without physically moving out.
One way to think about this is a typical video session is about 5 to 7 minutes. So using the video link, the doctor can see, 11, 10 patients an hour.
Yeah,
A very efficient use of the doctor's time.
right. But doctors are scarce. And
That's
doctors
all the more
are
reason to
key.
do it this way.
And I'm trying to understand what, drill down into that. What's going
All
on?
we're doing is multiplexing the doctor. We don't make him.
No, it's a different question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right. Double the number of doctors, that would be easy, but it's not,
People are working on that too.
can't be done
Right.
trivially.
People are working on that too. So now I'm getting low on time. This is all good discussion. I'm not complaining. It's a fine place to be. So the rest of this talk I actually haven't given before because I've tuned it for an HCI audience. In fact, I'm not an HCI researcher, so you'll probably have HCI questions for me that I can't answer, and I apologize for that in advance, in addition to medical questions that I can't answer. But I want to talk about a few things we're doing in literacy and education that are, more on the HCI side. So the first thing to realize is that voice is a big part of all developing countries. It's the biggest use of communications today, of IT today, is in fact voice. It's either phone calls or radio or arguably TV is at least a large part about voice. And there's been no work on speech recognition for these languages. So even though a voice interface would be a logical way to deal with low literacy or illiterate users, and in part because, again, the keyboards are not a good fit for many languages, including all the languages in India that are Sanskrit-based. So there's motivation to make voice work as an input modality, but it doesn't work very well. And of course, the way we do speech research historically is you learn a lot about the language, you try to encode that knowledge about the language into the recognizer. And my first claim is that's not realistic if you want to do many, many languages for which that stuff's not even well documented, let alone you have time to enter it all. So what we're doing instead essentially is sound recognition. So we're not going to try to understand the language at all. All we're going to do is say, maybe we can distinguish a bunch of different sounds in this language without knowing what they mean other than their distinct sounds. And that will work for some applications. It will not work for translation. It will not work for dictation. But it might work for user interface interactions. And that's what we're using it for. So the hope is that we can actually support small vocabulary UI interactions in any language. Right, language independent, but also speaker independent, because we don't have time to train it for each speaker. And on top of that, in a very noisy environment, because if you've ever been to India, but it's true for any urban area, it's always noisy, right? It's the rural areas can be quiet, although they're often noisy too. But the urban areas, there is no quiet place. It's actually quite disconcerting after a while. Unless you're at a really nice hotel, you can buy quiet, but if you're out on the street or in a crappy hotel, it's not quiet. So we're trying to get this kind of speech recognition to work. And I think there's two reasons to think this might work. So one is anything that's kind of menu-based or has a pull-down menu or checkboxes, those are things that could be done with a small number of words. right? So actually, the good reason we have lots of UI interactions could be mapped onto small numbers of words. The other thing to realize is we do know what context we're in. So if you make the recognizer context sensitive, you could say, I just asked you this question, and in this context, these 3 words are the words that make sense. So in fact, the game to play here from a kind of a toolkit perspective or UI perspective is, in each context, minimize the number of legitimate words, even down to 2, like yes and no. And if you get down to 2, your recognition accuracy is almost 100%, right? If you have to choose among, say, 66 words, which might be typical for entering a letter of the alphabet, your recognition accuracy is going to be lower.
So if you've got a low complexity, couldn't you just use, throw away the keyboard entirely and just do point and click?
We're throwing away the screen entirely, too, sometimes. The advantage of going to voice is you throw away the screen and the keyboard, which are 2 of the most expensive and unreliable parts of the system. Screen is particularly expensive in cost and in power. The keyboard is more expensive because it requires literacy, and it tends to be a bad choice even for people that are literate. Right? But yes, I think there's lots of reasons to think that voice could do significantly better and significantly cheaper. So the good news is we've got this working in Tamil, where it's working in Tamil where the data is in Tamil, but there's no knowledge in the system about the Tamil language per se. Right? It's not in any way specialized to Tamil. It would work equally well in any other language in the world. And we've so far been doing digits. So we can get pretty good recognition on digits using this kind of sound distinguishing. So I feel like that's pretty plausible that this is a valid approach. Another result we have, which is a little bit small, we're not working on anymore, is it turns out for this kind of speech recognition, which is a highly parallelizable task, you can build a custom processor that will do this at very low power. So 10,000 times less power than a Pentium and 100 times less power than a low power CPU. And that's because you don't really want a general purpose processor to do speech stuff. It's not a good fit for these kinds of applications. So this is not something we're going to build, but it's just nice to point out that here's a completely different research agenda driven from the same motivation, which is speech recognition, that has its own set of results. A little more on this literacy issue. This is a picture from real field work. This was taken by one of our postdocs, Madeline Plausch. And this is 2 Indian folks working for us interviewing a illiterate villager, or basically collecting training data. So when you do a speech recognizer, you still need some amount of training data. And I put this up here because it turns out no one's ever done how do you collect training data from illiterate speakers. The way it's usually done is you have them read the word. Guess what? That doesn't work. So we did digits so that we had some way to communicate with the person without saying the word, right? Can't say the word, you can't have them read the word, right? So we show them the word, and then they're supposed to say it, right? This does not work all that well. This works better than anything else we found. So other thing to notice in this, so that's what the fingers are for. Another thing to notice in this picture is that it's not one of my grad students or Madeline. That it didn't work to have a foreigner do the interviewing. It adds too much stress to the situation, and people under stress speak differently than people not under stress. So in fact, got to make the environment as comfortable as possible for the speaker, right? In fact, the other thing you could tell from that is that if you look, she's speaking into a phone. Phones make people less nervous than microphones, right? So it's actually important that that's a phone, even though it's really just a microphone in a phone box, right? So a lot of stuff in this picture. Where it's outdoors, it's not quiet. So even our training data was not very pure either, because this is the quietest spot we could find, but it's not that quiet. There's cattle, there's a bunch of issues going on in this picture. So I don't think that we've figured out actually how to do this perfectly yet. My point is there's a whole range of issues that have come up that are not in the literature, just in this picture. On the education front, I have 2 quick ones. One thing, looking at how computers are used in education, we found that it was very typical that you have a lot of students per PC. That makes sense. A typical classroom in India is about 300 students. Right, you might have 10 computers. So what do? You basically put a bunch of students in the computer room at one time in shifts. And even with shifts, you still have many more students than you have computers. And that's not going to change. That's been true in every country you've been to. So the question is, maybe we could improve the quality of education if we gave each student their own mouse? And I'll cut to the chase here. The short answer is yes. We have a few results we found. This is joint work with Microsoft India. In the case where you have one mouse, it turns out you'll get better educational results, measurably so, if you make each student click the mouse once and then pass it around. Right? What happens if you have one person using the mouse all the time is it's usually the person that knows the material the best, or is just the most dominant, typically a boy, and they take over the computer, and everyone else doesn't really learn anything. In fact, the computer goes at the speed of the fastest learner, and all the slower learners, of course, eventually get bored. And in fact, if you watch the videotape, we videotape these sessions, you can just see the kids start to mentally wander. They look in other places. Forcing the mouse to rotate actually keeps everyone involved, and the educational results on average go up. These are all small samples, I should qualify this. More interestingly, if you give each student their own mouse, it can have a significant impact on learning, like plus 30 or 40%, particularly on boys, but only if it's a collaborative use. So for example, we did an experiment where you have one game is whoever clicks on the right answer first gets a point. And the other game is same game, everyone has to click on the right answer before you go on to the next question. The collaborative one has significantly better educational value than the competitive one, for the same underlying reasons, which is the competitive one, the less performing students simply never get any points, they lose interest or even get embarrassed and don't participate. In the collaborative one, you actually are creating peer pressure on the good students to help the poor students. And that's, I think, what's actually increasing the quality of education. It's that the good students are helping the poor students. The computer, in fact, might be irrelevant, other than as a mechanism to force collaboration. I don't know. Second educational one is it turns out that one of the things that's universally would like to be learned is English. And turns out we know English, so it's actually a relatively good application for us. The idea is really that maybe we can teach English via cell phones. Cell phones, English learning is always better if it can be more immersive. And so maybe using a cell phone, we can have a non-formal education interaction that may be in the field, it could be on the bus, it could be lots of different places. Cell phones, of course, are already a better device for any kind of technology in these countries. They're socially accepted, they're of course cheaper, they have their own power source, they're ruggedized, so they're an excellent underutilized platform, which we'll be working on a lot. And so we're doing an experiment where basically can we create games that have educational value for learning English. This is one of the games. I actually don't know the exact purpose of this game. We've built 6 or 7 different games that we're trying. Student Matthew Kam that's doing this will be going back to India in January to actually do a more significant test. But what we have so far is, at least for learning vocabulary, using the cell phones, you can definitely see increased vocabulary education using the cell phone. So I would say very preliminary, but it looks quite promising. Again, you could do this on a PC, it's just we want to make it work on a cell phone because it's more realistic that kids will be able to have cell phones. If not their own, then maybe their families or someone they know. All right, so I'm going to wrap up so I can take a few more questions. So I would claim technology can and has made a difference. And what I can say now that I couldn't say 2 years ago is that our own group is, I think, now making a difference, particularly on the telemedicine, less so on the education, although I think it's early. I'm still hopeful for that. There's tons of room for computer science and electrical engineering research in these areas. There is need, and it's not a trivial area to get into, I will admit that, but it's an important area. And if you want to have a research career that has high impact and is personally fulfilling, I can definitely recommend this. Right? This is some of the most fulfilling work I've done, and I've done a lot of good stuff in my career, so I can't complain. But this is special. And for more details, we have a general paper that's from IEEE that talks about the broader case for technology research. That was in IEEE Computer, and of course we have a website and also a wiki and a blog. The blog is somewhat worth reading because it has lots of good stories that are of the kind I've been telling, which are just things you don't see every day. All right, let me stop here, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. We'll take a few general questions from patient folks.
Not a question. Oh. I'm very happy to do this presentation, just to thank you and to say it's really beautifully original. I am from Brazil.
It is, as I said, it's very rewarding work to do, and the students love it. The big issue, frankly, for the students is this in, say, 5 or 10 years, a subfield in which someone could get tenure? That, I think, is the open question. And that's totally for us to decide, right? We, the computer science community, have to decide what we value. There's the reasons it's not so easy for someone, a grad student in this area, to move on to a professorship and get tenure. In fact, the good news is, if it's going to happen, the easiest place is actually HCI, because HCI already has a good way to encompass social impact into its evaluation system. That's not true for computer science in general. But if it's going to happen, it's really it takes a little bit of awareness, which is why I give these talks, and what's possible. It also takes a little bit of, frankly, I'm not quite sure the word is. Think of it this way: the students that do work in this area are going to have less publications than people that do work that they can do entirely in their own lab, right? There's a significant unfair disadvantage to do field work in remote places. So I would argue they're going to have fewer publications. They will look worse on paper, but they will have the big bonus, which is they can say, 2,000 patients per month are using our system. So the hope is that kind of impact will make up for what will look like, frankly, a less competitive CV on the face of the traditional metrics of computer science, right? But that's a community decision. It's up to us to decide what we value. My hope in giving this talk is to change what we value a little bit. Let me go in the back.
Yeah, I don't think you need to be defensive about it, because clearly in the realm of wireless networking, there are a lot of challenges which are, for electrical engineers and computer scientists.
I've actually worked very hard to make sure all my PhD students have a problem that's technically deep on its own.
Right.
But that does limit the kinds of problems that we can do, actually. Because I think we're in this transition period where I have to play it both ways. I have to assume we have to be competitive on the pure technical merits in a traditional field, and we have to do all the stuff you need to do to actually make something work in the real world, which is a pretty tall order. But I think it's the right thing to do it in the short term. You've been very patient.
Yeah, I think you can make the case that anytime that you take an extreme application or like a marginal application, like in this case, there is actually a selfish benefit that it applies to the general consumer market. Even you take for example, closed captions. It's very useful in a noisy bar when you watch sport. When you get a phone call and you turn out the volume of the television, you can still use it. So this kind of applications, although it has a very targeted altruistic market, will eventually have a lot of application here in America, in Silicon Valley.
It's certainly fair to say there is no U.S. solution to rural connectivity that's any better than the solution we're deploying in India. Right? There is no good rural connectivity solution in the U.S. either. Right? We're not using it in the U.S. yet, but it's perfectly viable. And I actually hope that's one of the ones that will come back and make an impact. We'll see. By the way, on the closed captioning, it's also being used in India to teach literacy. So people that know Hindi by ear but don't know Hindi how to read actually read the captions as they hear Hindi. So it's Hindi voice subtitled in Hindi text. Right? And it turns out to be an excellent way to learn to read.
Two questions. First, about the $100 computer. Are you participating in this?
Long, complicated question of which you'll get a better answer off the air. But the public answer is, I think there are several good pieces of technology there that I'm glad are being invested in particular the screen. And I think the screen is a good thing regardless of what ends up happening with the laptop. The big problem with the laptop project, frankly, is really comes down to a basic HCI principle, which is iterative design. There is no excuse for building 300 million of the first iteration, right? It's unethical. It's simply unethical, right? Particularly when you're asking for $700 million from the governments of developing countries to pay for your first iteration. So I think there's no excuse for that except for ego, and I find that to be unethical. Now, that being said, I'd be very happy with the $10 million version of it that was the first iteration and had the same technical goals, but was much more realistic and less egotistical about how right the first design is going to be. Because there has never been a right first design in developing countries. right? Ever, as far as I can tell, right?
Second question is about digital TV. Do you have any project or taking more than digital TV or social benefits?
There is some TV use in education, particularly in Bangladesh, but we have not done any work in the TV space. We are about to do some work in the radio space. There's a pretty strong community radio, like AM radio effort in the world anyway, but it would be much better if all those radio stations actually had internet connectivity and could get MP3s or educational content from a much broader source. So in fact, one of the projects we're doing in Guinea-Bissau is the same wireless networks but being used to connect community radio stations. And that would work for community TV if that ever existed also, although that's the closest we have at the moment. But our Guinea-Bissau project is essentially about enabling community radio to be much more than it is.
Maybe the last question, and then you can come up and ask him more.
I'll take one more. I'll take
well,
two.
It's kind of a technical question, but I keep hearing about WiMAX. Is that gonna? I mean, what's your
WiMAX? You know, I'm happy with any technology that makes sense for deployment. At the moment, it doesn't because it's very expensive. Now, if the volume goes way up, it will be and which is the plan, at least for the people in the WiMAX forum, they would say the volume is going to go up. That would bring the cost down, and then it becomes a bit more viable. But that being said, WiMAX has the same fundamental limitation that cellular has, which is to say it basically is built on expensive base stations and low-cost clients. And that model works very well in a relatively dense urban area where you have a lot of users within the transmit radius of your base station to amortize the expensive cost of the base station. So I actually think it'll be complementary. In fact, one of the things I want to build is a Wi-Fi board that has a WiMAX card in it. So you put the Wi-Fi card, the Wi-Fi board essentially at the end of the WiMAX range. So you have an urban WiMAX base station using WiMAX to get to the first hop, and then you use Wi-Fi out from there to reach the more rural areas. That hybrid makes a lot of sense on a lot of fronts, and we'll try that. All right, I got to stop. Thank you very much.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.